Hey, what's going on? Jeff Ratcliffe here. You know, the New Orleans Saints annually are one of the best producers of fantasy options out there over the last decade. We know guys like Drew Brees, etc. But what about 2019? How does this team look for fantasy purposes? Let's preview the New Orleans Saints for 2019 fantasy football. And we're going to start with the running backs. Of course, Alvin Kamara over the last 2 years has really taken the league by storm. Kind of came out of nowhere in 2017 and was one of the top PPR backs out there. One of the top fantasy backs. Who am I kidding? But of course, he did have to split the backfield with Mark Ingram. Now, entering last year, Mark Ingram suspended for the first month of the season. And what did we see out of Kamara over that time? We saw nothing but fantasy goodness. 3 first-place fantasy finishes in the first month of the season. 4 games, 3 number 1 finishes. That is so hard to do over the course of a season, much less over 3 games. Kamara was lights out, and he ends up finishing the season as the number 5 PPR back. Now, of course, Mark Ingram's out of the mix. He's now in Baltimore. You do have Latavius Murray there, who's not quite Mark Ingram for sure, but he's no slouch either, so he's going to get work in that backfield. But still, when you look at Kamara, you definitely have to be considering him an elite option. In fact, I wouldn't talk you out of taking him first overall. I'm not going to do it myself, but he certainly is in that conversation. Kamara set for another big-time year with his ability as a receiver out of the backfield, with his ability as a runner between the tackles. He's just the complete package for a modern fantasy football running back. And I mentioned Latavius Murray. He's an interesting player as well. He's going to have some independent value of Alvin Kamara, but it's going to be a little bit boom or bust on a weekly basis. That being said, if Kamara got hurt, all of a sudden Latavius Murray becomes, potentially a back-end RB1, if not better, in that offense. So that's some premium handcuff value. That's something to be considered with Latavius Murray in drafts this year. Now, I mentioned Drew Brees at the top of the video, and we know this guy, Hall of Famer, give him the gold jacket now, no doubt about it. And for fantasy purposes, over a good chunk of his career, especially his career with the Saints, he's been an elite option. Annually, year in, year out, Drew Brees putting up enormous numbers. 5,000-yard seasons, which is just disgusting to think of. But of course, last year he didn't even top 4,000 yards on the season. So it's a different Drew Brees in this era of his career. It's a different Saints offense, but that's not to say that he can't put up fantasy production. Last year, 32 touchdown passes, so he can still get it done from a touchdown efficiency standpoint. 8th in fantasy scoring at the position. Now, if you notice, though, Drew Brees was a little up and down through the course of last year, and part of that is this new-look Saints offense. So keep that in mind this year. Brees is not an elite option anymore. I think you can consider him a quarterback 1, but he's definitely not an elite option. It could be a little bit of a bumpy ride yet again. And I think part of that really comes down to his limited weapons. Believe it or not, the Saints really don't have that many weapons for Brees to throw the ball to at wide receiver. Of course, Michael Thomas, yes, he's there. Yes, he's elite. He's awesome. He's coming off a 125 catch season. That's really good. But there really isn't anybody beyond Michael Thomas. Think about it. Ted Ginn coming to the end of his career. Sure, he gives you a little downfield ability, but boom or bust for fantasy purposes. Traquan Smith, boom or bust for fantasy purposes. We saw it last year. Now, he's a young player. We'll hopefully see him develop a little bit more this year, but not really a guy you're going to be trusting for fantasy purposes, and you really can't like that lack of depth for Brees. Now, I mentioned Michael Thomas, though, and some people have him as one of the top wide receivers off the board. I think, you have to look at him as just a tick below the clear top 2 guys for me this year. It's DeAndre Hopkins and Devontae Adams, but Thomas is right there. Now, the thing that separates those guys from Thomas, though, while Thomas has that uber high floor, the high catch volume, guy basically never drops anything, it's the fact that he wasn't heavily targeted in the red zone, and in particular in the end zone. Last year, just 6 end zone targets. He didn't even lead the team in end zone targets. Despite clearly leading the team in targets as a whole, Traquan Smith actually led the team in end zone targets, which I guess bodes positively for him at least. That's a good number there. 9 for Traquan, 6 for Michael Thomas. I mean, when you consider that the league leader was Antonio Brown with 23, 6 for Michael Thomas, that is a very low number. And why are end zone targets important? Because as a receiver, if you get targeted in the end zone, you you have your greatest chance of scoring a touchdown. So that's an important number to note there with Michael Thomas. But we're splitting hairs. He's the third or fourth receiver off the board. He's still really, really awesome. Another player, though, and I talk about wide receivers, but Drew Brees does have a receiving threat coming into the mix here this year in Jared Cook. Now, a tight end, obviously, last year, number 5 among tight ends in fantasy scoring. But if you've owned Cook before last year, you know the frustrations that Jared Cook can sometimes bring for fantasy purposes. Up and down, streaky. One week he'll go for, 8 catches for 90 yards and a score. The next week he'll go for 1 catch for 15 yards. Well, some of that sort of went away last year in Oakland, and I think, we're seeing Cook coming more towards the twilight of his career, but really rounding into form, coming into a good situation where there's going to be minimal competition for targets. And when you think about it, with the wide receivers that I just mentioned, okay, Thomas is going to get his. We know Alvin Kamara will get his as a receiver as well in terms of target share. But could Jared Cook be right up there? Could Jared Cook out-target Ted Ginn? Could Jared Cook certainly out-target Traquan Smith or whoever's the number 3 receiver? Absolutely, and maybe out-target Ted Ginn as well. With that sort of volume, with his upside in this offense, Jared Cook, a rock-solid tight end 1 option this year. So there you have it, the 2019 New Orleans Saints. If you want to see where all of these guys land in our fantasy football rankings, you can check those out at ProFootballFocus.com.